They flew without a guarantee. April 29, 1945. A Lancaster bomber named Bad Penny lifts off from England. The Germans have not yet signed the agreement that would allow it through. The pilot is 21 years old, from Windsor, Ontario. He flies at 50 feet lower than the rooftops. The bomb bay holds no bombs, only food. Below, a nation is starving to death. Above, a young Canadian flies directly at German guns with no certainty they will hold their fire. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary acts of the entire war. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. Now let us go back to where this story truly begins. Not in the air over the Netherlands, in the streets below. By the autumn of 1944, the Dutch people had been living under Nazi occupation for more than 4 years. German administration had been methodical. Forced labor, the systematic murder of Jewish citizens, and the steady dismantling of civic life. But what was about to happen would be different in kind. Not occupation as oppression, but occupation as deliberate mass starvation. In September, the Dutch government in exile called for a national railway strike to support the Allied airborne operation at Arnhem. Operation Market Garden failed. Allied lines froze. Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi administrator of the Netherlands, responded with a complete embargo on food shipments to the western provinces, reinforced in November when river and road transport was also blocked. Approximately 3.5 million people, the population of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht and surrounding areas, were to be starved into submission. By December, average daily rations had fallen below 800 calories. By February of 1945, some urban areas were receiving far less. For context, a sedentary adult requires roughly 2,000 calories per day. At 800, the body begins consuming itself. Cities looked picked clean, every tree stripped for firewood, building facades dismantled for fuel, streets empty except for figures moving with the slow, deliberate shuffle of people conserving what little energy remained. The Dutch called it the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. An estimated 20,000 Dutch civilians would die before it ended. The worst civilian catastrophe in Western Europe during the entire war. While the Western Netherlands starved, the 1st Canadian Army, commanded by General Henry Duncan Graham Crerar, had been fighting through Belgium and the southern Netherlands since autumn. The Battle of the Scheldt alone had cost nearly 13,000 Canadian dead, wounded and missing, but it opened Allied supply lines through Antwerp. By April of 1945, 2 Canadian corps were advancing into the Netherlands simultaneously, the largest Canadian force ever assembled under a single command, with 2 inseparable objectives: destroy what remained of the German military and reach the people in time. In Ottawa, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands had followed every development from exile. Her youngest daughter, Margaret, had been born in Ottawa Civic Hospital in January of 1943, the Canadian government having temporarily declared the maternity ward extraterritorial so the child would hold Dutch citizenship alone. Juliana had spent nearly 5 years in a country that had welcomed her family while her own country suffered. The intelligence reports about the Hunger Winter had grown so dire she had initially doubted their accuracy. They were accurate. If anything, they understated the reality. The liberation of the northern Netherlands unfolded across 2 simultaneous axes in April of 1945, each telling a different part of the same story. In the northeast, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was advancing through Drenthe toward Groningen. On the night of April 11th, a man named Samuel Schrijver slipped out of a transit camp called Westerbork and went looking for the Canadians. Schrijver had been imprisoned at Westerbork since February of 1944, arrested for smuggling forged identity cards for Jews in hiding, resistance work for which he had been beaten during interrogation and sent to the punishment block. Now he had a single purpose. Westerbork looked from the outside like a German military installation, barbed wire, guard towers, a large compound in the middle of farmland. He was certain the Canadians would attack it, without knowing that approximately 876 prisoners remained inside. After overcoming the initial suspicion of Canadian officers, Schrijver guided a patrol back toward the camp. On the morning of April 12th, No. 7 Troop of B Squadron of the 8th Canadian Reconnaissance Regiment followed the railway line north, found the enclosure, and entered through the open gate. Lieutenant Ted Shepard, the troop officer, later described arriving at the parade ground to complete silence. Then the barrack doors opened. Between 1942 and 1944, 107,000 people, Jews, Sinti, and Roma, had been transported through Westerbork on 93 outgoing trains to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Sobibor, to Bergen-Belsen, to Theresienstadt. Every Tuesday, a train had departed. Roughly 55% of those sent to Auschwitz were killed on arrival. Virtually all who went to Sobibor were killed. Of the 107,000, only an estimated 5,000 survived the war. Among those who had passed through Westerbork was Anne Frank. Arrested in Amsterdam on the 4th of August 1944, she was deported from Westerbork on the 3rd of September. On the very last train to Auschwitz, 1,019 people in sealed cattle cars. From Auschwitz, she and her sister Margot were transferred to Bergen-Belsen in November. Both died of typhus in February of 1945, weeks before British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen, and weeks before Canadians reached the camp that had been Anne Frank's last stop in the Netherlands. The 876 survivors who remained had been held back from deportation by paperwork, exemptions, and circumstances that had somehow held. An elderly man climbed onto Lieutenant Shepard's armored car. He unpinned from his jacket the yellow cloth Star of David, the badge the Germans had forced him to wear, and pressed it into Shepard's hands. Shepard kept it for the rest of his life. One day later, on April 13th, the same division turned north toward Groningen. 7,000 German soldiers, including Wehrmacht remnants, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine units, and Dutch and Belgian Waffen-SS forces, had fortified the medieval city. The Ring Canal meant the city could only be entered across 12 bridges, most destroyed or razed. Major General A.B. Matthews, commanding the 2nd Division, made the decision that defined the battle before it began. Heavy artillery and air support were forbidden within the populated urban area. His soldiers would take the city by infantry and armor alone, accepting heavier casualties to protect civilians. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Essex Scottish, and the Calgary Highlanders fought building by building through the narrow lanes of the Oude Stad. The Essex Scottish used Kangaroo armored personnel carriers to rush the Herenbrug Bridge before the Germans could destroy it. The fiercest fighting centered on Grote Markt, the central market square, where German machine gun positions had fortified the north side. Canadian tanks destroyed the buildings directly, the only way to eliminate the defenders without endangering civilians elsewhere. 4 days, 43 Canadians killed, 166 wounded, approximately 100 Dutch civilians dead in the crossfire, over 5,200 Germans taken prisoner. The people of Groningen have never used the civilian toll as grievance. They have acknowledged it as the cost of a liberation they chose not to resent. While Groningen was being fought for in the northeast, the western cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, remained occupied and starving. A conventional assault was planned and executable. It was also nearly certain to kill thousands of civilians too weak to evacuate. What was needed had no template in military doctrine. Negotiations between Allied and German commanders produced a preliminary agreement on April 28th. German forces would allow Allied aircraft to drop food without firing. In exchange, the ground advance in certain sectors would temporarily halt. A ceasefire inside a war still being fought, but on the morning of April 29th, Reichskommissar Seyss-Inquart had not yet formally signed. At RAF Ludford Magna in Lincolnshire, a Lancaster was loaded with 40,000 pounds of food: flour, canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, sugar. The aircraft's nickname was Bad Penny. Its pilot was Flight Sergeant Robert Fairfull Upcott, 21 years old, from Windsor, Ontario, flying with No. 101 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. 5 of the 7 crew were Canadian. Upcott had flown dozens of bombing missions over Germany. Bad Penny flew across the North Sea, crossed the Dutch coast and descended to 50 feet. Rooftop height, well within range of any weapon larger than a rifle. A Dutch teenager named Peter Buttenaar, stealing toward a German supply depot to find food for his starving family, heard the engines and dove into a ditch. He looked up. He saw crew members waving from the windows as the Lancaster passed overhead. He watched food fall. The Germans did not fire. Wireless operator Stan Jones radioed back to headquarters, "Proceed." That afternoon, 200 more Lancasters followed. Operation Manna had begun. 3,298 Royal Air Force sorties over 10 days, approximately 7,000 tons of food. The United States Army Air Forces joined on May 1st with Operation Chowhound, 2,268 sorties, roughly 4,000 additional tons. Canadian trucks drove overland under Operation Faust, beginning May 2nd. More than 11,000 tons in 10 days, falling across a nation that had been waiting for months to see whether anyone was coming. Canadian ground forces entered the major Dutch cities in the first days of May. What they found confirmed the intelligence reports and still exceeded what those reports had prepared veterans for. The language that appears in soldiers' diaries and letters from this period carries a consistent quality of shock. Veterans of 4 years of combat described the civilian population of the Western Netherlands in terms that had no military equivalent. Not thin, not malnourished, skeletal. Adults whose bodies had consumed themselves down to the minimum tissue required to keep vital organs functional. Children who looked at chocolate bars with an expression beyond hunger, something closer to disbelief that such a thing still existed. German propaganda had warned Dutch civilians for months that the liberating forces were brutal and dangerous, that the liberation would be an exchange of one occupation for another. In a population physically depleted by months near the edge of survival, the capacity to critically evaluate such warnings was limited. Some people hid when the first Canadian vehicles arrived. What happened in those first encounters contradicted the propaganda so completely that the contradiction itself became part of how the Dutch remembered the liberation. Soldiers sharing personal rations. Medics treating children with the same attention they would give family. Engineers repairing water pumps and electrical systems without being ordered to, recognizing these were survival issues. The pattern repeated across dozens of cities, consistent in character, even as specific circumstances differed. The formal German surrender for the Netherlands was signed on May 5, 1945, at the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen. Lieutenant General Charles Folkers, commanding the 1st Canadian Corps, received the capitulation from German General Johannes Blaskowitz. In the same town on the same afternoon, Canadian soldiers were observed teaching Dutch children to play baseball in the street outside, the formal end of an occupation being signed in one building, while children who had nearly starved were learning to run bases in the spring sunlight. Witnesses recorded the juxtaposition as surreal. It captured something true about the nature of what had just happened. 3 days earlier, Princess Juliana had returned to her country after nearly 5 years in exile. The return carried the full weight of what her people had endured while she was safe, and the full scope of what Canada had done. She decided that gratitude of this scale required an expression equal to it. In 1945, Princess Juliana sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa. Not a symbolic gesture, a transformative one, enough to fill parks across the capital. When they bloomed in the spring of 1946, they turned parts of the city into something that looked more like Amsterdam than a Canadian capital. The Netherlands established an annual commitment immediately, 20,000 bulbs sent every year without interruption. When Juliana became queen in 1948, the tradition continued under royal authority. The Canadian Tulip Festival, officially established in 1953, grew into one of the largest such festivals in the world. At Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery, more than 2,600 Canadian soldiers lie in the largest Canadian military cemetery in Europe. Dutch volunteers, children and grandchildren of people who were alive in 1945, maintain individual graves. Some families have passed responsibility for the same headstone across 3 generations, learning the hometown carved in the stone, finding it on a map, carrying that name forward. On anniversaries they bring flowers, on rainy days they wipe the stone dry. It is not a grand gesture, it is steady, and steadiness is how memory survives. Samuel Shriver, who had slipped out of Westerbork to guide the Canadians back through the gate, later emigrated to Canada in 1954, the country whose soldiers he had found in the dark. Lieutenant Shepard kept the yellow star for the rest of his life. Rosa Flamm, hidden in the camp infirmary when the armored cars arrived, maintained a correspondence with him that lasted until his death, and later planted a tree in his honor in Israel. Michael Fried, who at 12 years old watched Canadians arrive at Westerbork, spent 42 years in the United States Army and in retirement made a point of personally thanking Canadian forces for what their predecessors had done for him as a child. These are not footnotes. They are the actual record of what happened between specific people and what those moments became over the 81 years that followed. What the liberation demonstrated, through Westerbork and Groningen and the Bad Penny and the food drops, was a particular kind of military conduct, one in which the mission was defined more broadly than tactical objectives, in which the decision to accept heavier Canadian casualties rather than use artillery in a populated city was made and carried out, in which a 21-year-old from Windsor flew at 50 feet over German guns without a formal guarantee, because the people on the ground below were running out of time. Every spring the bulbs arrive from the Netherlands, the tulips bloom in Ottawa, and in both countries and in schools and museums and cemeteries and at family tables, the same story is told again. Not because it is required, because the people who lived it made sure that forgetting was not possible. They are nearly all gone now, but they built something that outlasted them.